It started like any other morning, except it wasn't. At 6:42 a.m., the United States woke up to a world without ICE. It not defunded, not reorganized, not even discussed in press releases. Just gone. Buildings locked themselves automatically. Phone lines disconnected. Emails vanished. The agency that had policed borders, processed immigrants, and carried out deportations no longer existed. At first it seemed like a glitch, a bureaucratic hiccup. By noon it became clear the glitch was permanent. Migrants across the country noticed it first. People who had been scheduled for deportation were suddenly unassigned. Officers who were supposed to pick them up never arrived. Phones rang endlessly with no answer. Some tried to cross borders and found checkpoints unmanned, roads blocked, then abandoned. But freedom didn't feel like freedom, because nowhere was safe. Local communities near detention centers and border towns were suddenly abandoned by the federal structures that had policed them. Structures some had feared and others had relied on. Crime rose overnight. Gangs and militias claimed authority, targeting anyone they suspected of being undocumented. Families who had survived raids for years now had no protection, no law, no one to call.
Ow.
In some neighborhoods, the residents didn't mourn ICE. They had hated the agency for years. But soon, they realized that the vacuum left behind was worse than anything ICE had ever enforced. Hospitals, schools, and city services were overwhelmed by refugees suddenly unprocessed. People who had lived in limbo for years now wandered the streets legally free, but utterly vulnerable. They had no IDs, no support, no access to shelter or medical care. Panic swept through small towns near the border. Supermarkets were emptied in hours. Gas stations were raided. Fires burned along highways. People barricaded themselves in homes, staring out windows at convoys of armed men who called themselves enforcers, but answered to no one. Meanwhile, reports of abandoned ICE facilities coming alive at night began to leak online. Journalists sneaked into decommissioned detention centers and found lights humming, monitors blinking, cameras followed movement. But no one was inside. Audio recordings captured whispers in multiple languages, crying, screams, and a voice that always ended with the same sentence. Timeline stabilized. Observation ongoing. Former agents went into hiding. They posted videos anonymously, their faces shaking. They claimed the agency had been removed from reality, erased from public memory, but not from existence. Some said that immigrants who had been in detention were still being watched, moved and experimented on by an unknown force. By the third day, chaos became structured terror. Border towns saw armed groups forming spontaneously. Some residents welcomed them, hoping for protection. Others were hunted for suspected collusion with former ICE operations. Immigrant families who had hidden for years were forced to flee their homes again, this time into the desert or crowded urban slums, where survival meant begging, scavenging, or worse. Rivers that had once marked the border became dangerous. Without enforcement, smugglers and traffickers ruled. People who had hoped the agency's disappearance would mean freedom now discovered a nightmare. Lawlessness on an unimaginable scale. Yet the most terrifying part wasn't the human chaos. It was what never appeared on the news. Every surveillance drone over border towns, every traffic camera, every federal building was still active. But they no longer answered to humans. Screens showed live feeds of people moving, speaking, hiding, but the observers were not human. Agents who had disappeared from the world began appearing again, only in flickering shadows, faceless, moving in impossible ways. Some immigrants claimed they felt presence in their homes. Doors would slam without wind. Phones would ring with no caller. Whispers spoke languages they didn't know, sometimes repeating their names. Some were taken at night, leaving nothing behind but their shoes. By the fifth day, Americans in cities far from the border began to feel the ripple. Power outages hit major metros as hackers' real or imagined attack systems left vulnerable without ICE oversight. Food shortages started in urban centers, as truck drivers abandoned routes where authorities no longer existed. Hospitals struggled with the influx of displaced people, many of whom had nowhere else to go. In small towns, residents reported families disappearing overnight. No signs of struggle, no bodies. Just empty homes, beds still made, meals left on tables. Rumors spread. The missing were being relocated by a force beyond comprehension, the same force that had erased ice. Then came the leaks. Anonymous files appeared on government servers. They weren't just memos. They were plans, diagrams, lists. One line repeated in every document: the agency must be removed. Observation continues. Stability achieved through controlled chaos. The files suggested that ICE had not failed or been erased for political reasons. It had been removed by something higher, something calculating, an experiment, a reset. And the immigrants, the communities, the residents, they were all part of it. By day 10, reality had shifted. Some people stopped asking questions. Some fled the cities and towns entirely, joining caravans through the desert. Others barricaded themselves at home, convinced that being seen meant being taken. And yet every night drones and lights traced patterns through the sky. Screens flickered with impossible images. Children walking alone in the desert. Families vanishing mid-step. Convoys of ghostly vehicles moving without drivers. A new order had replaced the old. Not humans, not law. Something else. Something watching. Something patient. And the whispers began to spread. They never left. They never forgot. We are still here. No one knows what became of ICE agents. No one knows what became of the immigrants. And no one is safe. Because when an entire agency can vanish, and no one remembers it existed, the real terror is not what is missing. Real terror is what's watching in the shadows. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button and let me know. Drop a comment with your biggest what if, and who knows. The next video might be your what if, and if you love stories that make you think, subscribe, because what if you miss the next one?